Hi guys, and welcome back to Consuming Energy Resources. Today in lesson 4 we're going to be looking at oil extraction and production, and in fact we're going to be looking at oil over the next 2 lessons because it's a really significant portion of the energy that we extract, or fossil fuels that we extract. Now, that doesn't mean that it is the most popular source of energy. Unfortunately, coal is one of the most popular sources of energy, but it is something that's very important, not just as a source of energy, but also as a resource which we use in a variety of different industries, whether that's clothing, cosmetics, plastic production, pharmaceuticals and medicines, loads and loads of different things that have oil products in them. So in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about how we extract it, how we get out of the ground. So let's get started. Right then, we're looking at conventional oil extraction and distribution today. And when we say that word conventional, we mean like ordinary oil extraction. So we're going to do that, talk about how we actually get it out of the ground. And then we're going to think a bit about the consequences for the global economy and international relations. Now, today's lesson might be surprising to you in that it has quite a lot of politics in it. So we're talking about the relationships between countries based on the oil that they have, or if they don't have it, the oil that they need to buy. So in this diagram, we're looking at very classic oil extraction, and it starts off with us building a rig and drilling a well, which is basically a big pipe that goes down through the Earth's layers to reach a reservoir of oil. And that reservoir of oil has been formed and created hundreds of millions of years ago. So once it's empty, it will be gone. But it's effectively like a little pocket of oil in the Earth's crust. And we suck it out through the straw, we pump it out using these lovely machines, and then we are able to pump it into storage tanks, say for instance ones that go on the back of trains like this, or the ones that you've probably seen most commonly are sort of your oil tankers on the back of lorries, and just very similar to like a container ship where you have those sort of rectangular boxes. These are standard size oil tankers, so actually you can use cranes to lift them on and off trains and lorries, and even eventually boats. So this is the sort of transport network. It will vary from country to country. In some places they have good train networks, in other places it will be coming over land by truck or lorry, and then when you've got to export it abroad, generally you'll be using boats. Now, this is not always the case. There are times where or places where you would have pipelines across the landscape, and that's something we're going to look at a little bit in another lesson. But many island countries in particular, including the UK and Japan and other places like that, get a lot of their oil fuel through boat transport. But this is not the only place that we can dig. This is your kind of classic southern Texas or maybe Saudi Arabia digging in the desert. But we can also find a large amount of oil resources underneath our seabeds. And you'll find both oil and gas often underneath the seabed. And this, again, is considered sort of normal oil extraction. It is more expensive and much more difficult than this type of oil extraction, but it is still been going on for such a long time that's considered sort of normal. It still involves just drilling a pipe. Obviously the pipe is kind of suspended in the water, tapping into the reservoir and then drawing it out. Now, one of the reasons that this deep sea oil extraction or drilling is so dangerous is because the oil and the gas down here is not just underneath the layers of rock, but also underneath the sea. And this is putting enormous pressure on that oil. Now, when you make a hole in that, just like if you were to accidentally poke a hole in a can of Coke, it all comes spraying out. So the oil that is in here is under huge pressure and it's trying to escape up the pipe. Now, the pipe is obviously designed to control the flow of the oil so that it can be transferred onto the tankers and then taken away. You don't want an uncontrolled flow of the oil, but where that happens, you end up with a leak. And this is what happened with the Deepwater Horizon issue, where there was a leak at the base of the pipe, and the oil started leaking out both into the ocean, in the deep ocean, and also on the surface of the ocean. And this really, really is, devastating for the environment. So in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which is just off the coast of New Mexico in the USA, it led to BP, who were the oil company who ran the rig at the time, being fined $12 billion. And the damage that oil spill caused was devastating. More than 8,000 marine birds and mammals were found dead on the beaches in just 6 months after the oil spill. And many, many more, creatures would have been killed by this oil spill, but never found or counted. Even tourism in the area declined because the beaches that, are normally so beautiful in that part of the USA were washing up oil slicks onto the beaches. So nobody wanted to go and sunbathe or go fishing. And some people even found that the oil all over the land as it was washing up from the sea was starting to impact their health. They're getting headaches, sore eyes and throats and stuff like that. So just on this first task then, there is just 3 questions I want you to answer on your worksheet. A little reminder that your worksheet looks like this, and we're about to do these first 3 questions. So our first question is, how do we get the oil out using conventional methods? What 2 things have I mentioned twice? It should be that we are drilling a pipe and pumping the oil out and then transporting it away. How have we said we can transport the oil? There are 3 methods of transporting the oil that we've seen in the images, and one which was not in the image but does happen sometimes, a bit more of a permanent thing. And you should have got for that, of course, ships, trains, lorries, and potentially you may have got a pipeline as well. So this is our sort of great big oil pump in its classic format. And our third question for task 1 is just, why might we sometimes call oil black gold? Why is it that we sometimes call it black gold? Well, the answer to that, I hope, is reasonably obvious. Oil is a very, very profitable business to be in. Although it's very expensive to build all of the machinery and maintain it, it is such a high demand good that the price that it sells for, although it goes up and down, it fluctuates, tends to earn people enormous profits. So black gold is the sort of term that we might use when we're talking about how valuable oil can be and how much it can sell for. Now, there's a little video down here that you are welcome to watch if you so choose. I would say it's really good and it is quite challenging, but I'm not going to play it here in the PowerPoint, in the presentation, sorry. You can go back and watch it when you do your lesson, please. So we're going to have a look now at a graph, and we're going to do our second task, which is to describe the trend on this graph. Now, describing the trend in global oil consumption. This whole graph is all about oil, and it tells us world oil consumption in million barrels per day over a period of time. And then here what we've got is a compound graph. And the reason I say it's compound is because it's built up in layers, and each layer represents a different part of the world. So you've got North America, which seems to have had pretty stable, quite large oil consumption over time since 1965 to 2005. We've got, again, South and Central America, pretty steady, growing slightly. But ones that are particularly growing dramatically, Asia Pacific went from only a few million barrels a day, maybe less than 5 million barrels a day in 1965, now to having, almost as much consumption, this is use, how much oil they're using, almost as much consumption as North America as well. And of course up here then Europe and Eurasia starting off a bit smaller but growing rapidly. And perhaps we're seeing a small dip in this later part of Europe's oil consumption. Now, when we describe a graph like this, you're going to follow the following advice. I want you to give me the T on the graph. I want T for trend. Overall, what happens in the graph? The top line has gone from being about 31, 32 million barrels a day all the way up to, let's say, over 80 million barrels a day. Okay, and then we're going to give some evidence. So in fact, we've just done that. We've worked out the numbers that we're going to use as our evidence. So we're going to say, overall, what happens in the graph? Global oil consumption has increased over time. Okay, then we give our evidence, our numbers that give the example. And then for our third and final point, to make sure we get that third point, we need to give another point or an example that doesn't fit the trend. So it might be that we're commenting on how much Asia Pacific's consumption has grown. Maybe we would comment on the fact that South and Central America's consumption seems to be quite steady. Or even that Europe and Eurasia had a large peak in the 1980s and then actually managed to decrease the amount of oil that they've been using. Not hugely, but there is some decrease in the amount of oil that Europe is using. So pause the video, take 5 minutes and write me an answer, please. Off you go. So you should be done with your description of overall oil consumption. And one thing that we saw there is that oil consumption is growing. Now, what I don't want you to forget is that in fact, all energy consumption across the world has been growing over time. If we look at this graph over here, this is billions of tons of oil equivalent. Now, equivalent means to make something the same. But of course, it's very difficult to say, well, 1 barrel of oil is equal to 1 barrel of coal. That's not the case, okay? So what we do is we kind of convert them all into the same unit, and we use this tons of oil equivalent measure, TOE, okay? So what we see in this graph is pretty similar. Overall, the amount of energy we're using over time is going up, and in the future, it is projected or predicted to continue to increase in terms of our overall demand. But what makes up each of these individual bars at different points in time, where we get our energy from, does change. And if we express that as a percentage, it could be done as a pie chart, but in this case, we're doing it as a line graph. Here's what we see. Hydroelectric power, although it's grown, this blue bit, has grown overall as a percentage of the energy that we use globally, it has stayed pretty much the same. Oil has grown, but not as much as the overall amount of energy that we've used. And so we find that oil consumption as a percentage, not overall, but as a percentage, is actually decreasing. Our gas consumption is going up, and maybe that surprises you, but just a quick reminder that gas consumption means methane. And because methane has such a short hydrocarbon chain, it burns very cleanly. You should all know the combustion reaction for methane, which is methane plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water, okay, because methane is CH4. So CH4 plus O2 goes to CO2 plus H2O, okay? And because of that reaction being so simple and clean, there's no incomplete combustion, there's no soot, there's no other particulates, there's no nitrous oxide or carbon monoxide or anything like that, we actually have made gas more and more popular. Coal goes through its variations, but we're looking at a decreasing trend for coal, which is quite positive to say. And And it's worth noting that we have these, overall increase in the amount of oil and energy consumed, but as far as oil is concerned, a decreasing proportion of it is coming from oil. Now, part of this is linked to this concept of peak oil, and I have a very simple graph here. It's not a precise graph as this one is based on real data. This is a theory graph. And the theory that we're talking about here is that at some point, while we were discovering oil, oil became more and more available to us and more plentiful. And at some point, we've reached peak oil. And perhaps this has already happened. Maybe it hasn't happened yet, but it's very close by. And from that point where we've been producing loads and loads of oil, huge production of oil, we're either running out of it or we are using less of it. We're choosing to use less of it. Now, this point of peak oil is a theoretical point at which half of the known oil reserves have been used. And the theory is mostly based on limited amounts of supply. We should know already that oil is a non-renewable resource. Okay, it's a finite resource. And so, once you've gotten over halfway through all the oil that exists on the planet, you're over halfway. There's no making any more. Now, this is starting to be challenged as to whether or not we'll reach peak oil in the same way we expected to. And this is, as I say, an excellent video that you can watch if you really want to challenge your thinking about what we mean by peak oil. But together, we're going to watch this video, and I'm going to ask you to answer these questions which are on your worksheet. So these questions here, they're all very short answers. You just click in the box and type straight in for me. So, what do we really mean when we talk about peak oil? I'm going to explain it to you and you're answering the questions as you go. So oil is a limited resource. There's a certain amount of it, and as we use it up, we'll get down to zero eventually. And the reason it's limited is because it takes hundreds of millions of years to form. You can't get any more. So peak oil is when extraction, taking it out of the ground, maxes out. It gets to the top of the pile, and we hit that 50% mark here for how much oil is remaining. And then eventually the oil will decline and eventually run out. That means that after we get the peak, the demand will continue to go up for oil. The majority of the oil that we use is turned into petrol. So we extract huge amounts of oil and 44% of it is made into gasoline or petrol. The rest of it is turned either into other fuels or into other products. And there are actually a surprising number of products. We use it to tarmac our roads. We use oil to produce farm chemicals, particularly fertilizers and pesticides, or machinery as well. We use it to coat food and create preservatives. So perhaps in places that we're not expecting to see oil, even in our plastics, whether that's plastic bottles, toys, cups, all of those things that take a long time to biodegrade actually come from oil. And perhaps surprisingly to you, the chemicals in your cosmetics and the clothing that you wear can all be made out of oil as well. So loads and loads of other oil products, and we often call these petrochemical products. But after we've passed peak oil, what are we looking at? What problems could we get? Well, prices could go up, and that can affect all kinds of other prices, from manufacturing to food, and it can cause shortages if that has a knock-on effect, and shortages can lead to economic depressions or conflict over those resources, as well as, of course, global warming. How could you forget that? Or the oil could be conserved. We actually could be in a position where the demand for oil shrinks, and that's what that second video was about. Unusual perhaps to imagine that we can control ourselves, but if we can switch to alternative energy sources, if we can put fewer cars on the road or switch to energy efficient cars, we might have a sustainable and healthy future. So will peak oil happen? And if it does happen, when will it happen? Well, the answer is we don't really know. We keep predicting that it's going to happen, but for one thing is certain, it will be in this century, in these couple of, maybe even half a century, 50 years, where we have to prevent ourselves from using as much oil and other fossil fuels as we have been. So if you need to rewind the video and answer your questions, go ahead and do that. Make sure you've got some answers before you look at my answers now. Okay, I'm assuming you've got some answers, so you should know that oil is a limited resource because it's non-renewable and it takes hundreds of millions of years to form. That means that the supply is only ever gonna go down. We're never gonna have any increased supply of oil because supply means how much of it is available. So peak oil, what is it? It's where we've used up over half of all the oil that exists. And after peak oil, we assume that demand will continue to go up, will continue to rise, reducing the amount of oil available and potentially pushing up prices. Now, that is not guaranteed. It's possible that we experience some radical change to the global economy in which demand for oil falls away and nobody wants to use it anymore. But that doesn't seem like the most likely scenario. Of all of the oil that we extract, what percentage of it is turned into fuel? Now, if you'd put 44%, because that is the amount we turn into petrol or gasoline, that is fine. But if you had added up 44% and 35% to reach... Oh, quick maths, come on, Miss Paul. It's so late, I can't even do this in my head. 79%, then that I will accept that one too. 3 uses for oil other than petrol. You could have had any of these 6 things. We've had tarmac, fertilizers or pesticides for farming, plastics, cosmetic products, or clothing. As we pass peak oil, what problems could be caused? I actually didn't put global warming on here. How could I have been so bad as to forget? But rising prices of oil, and that leads to rising prices of all kinds of other things, shortages of products, and even potentially conflict or resource wars. In order to shrink our demand and conserve our oil, we could potentially be putting fewer cars on the road and switching to renewable alternatives. This last one down here, I want it in your own words. What do you understand to be meant by peak oil? That is actually an exam question that I have seen in an actual exam. Explain what is meant by peak oil. So you need to be able to say a bit more than this third question here. You've got to flesh it out because you need 2 marks. You have to explain it a little bit. So you should have written, hopefully, something that sounds similar to this. Peak oil describes the point at which oil consumption falls and prices rise because there is either too little supply remaining, we're running out of it, it becomes rarer, and therefore the price goes up, or people don't want it, and so the amount of oil that we consume also goes down. So we've used these 2 words quite a lot, consumption and production, okay? And in terms of economics and in terms of this, when we say consumption, we're talking about the oil that we use. That's the petrol we put in our cars, the oil that makes the plastics, the oil that gets burnt for energy. And production is about how much we can make. Now, it's a bit false to say that we produce oil because it's a natural resource. It exists without human intervention. But we definitely do have to extract it. We have to take it out of the ground and we have to process it. We have to sort of refine it, take out your different types of oil. So there is some production involved, okay? Now, since 1983, the price of oil per barrel has seen big fluctuations. Now, fluctuations is movements up and down. And the reason that the price has been rising and falling is influenced by changes in supply and demand. So consumption, our use of oil, is about how much oil we need or want, and that is therefore demand. Production is about how much oil we're getting out of the ground and putting into the world and supplying. So production is supply and consumption is demand. But it's not just how much we're using and how much we're making that has an impact. It can also be major global events, and it can influence the relationships of countries. significantly, depending on whether or not they have oil, whether they need oil, whether or not there is a conflict which is affecting the supply of oil. So it really affects the relationships between countries. And this is why we're starting to say there's a lot of politics in today's lesson. What I have here is a little cartoon. I personally think it's fantastic. We've got our Saudi or Middle Eastern sheikh with his oil extraction on the left, and we've got the US oil companies on the right. And this kind of is to illustrate the competition between these two groups. These are the two largest producers of oil in the world, and they do compete. But the more oil they put out into the world and sell, the lower the price goes. So let's have a look at how oil prices have changed over time. As you can see here, the oil price goes up and down all over the place. And if we want to annotate, as we can see on here, a variety of different geopolitical and economic events which have affected the price of oil. So let's have a look over here, for example. There was a revolution in Iran, one of the world's largest producers of oil. And as there was revolution in Iran, there was not very little production going on. The supply was limited. And so the price of oil went up. The Iran-Iraq war also caused a spike in the price of oil. And as things get more calm following the war, the price of oil goes back down again. Again, you've got another war. So lots of the wars in the Middle East, and it's difficult not to be biased here because the politicians will tell you that war in the Middle East has nothing to do with oil production. But the fact is that Iraq has been invaded twice. Iran has been invaded. Kuwait and the rest of the Arabian Gulf has been invaded multiple times. So why is it that Britain, France, the USA feel the need to invade countries that they have very little to do with otherwise? Whatever reasons they give at the time, often following those conflicts, there are lots of benefits to British and American oil companies to get access to the resources that those countries have. So, a little bit suspicious, I would say. Over here, then, we've got Iraq invading Kuwait. That leads to a spike in the oil price and then a fall again. The Asian financial crisis. Now, this is an interesting one. Where we've got a financial crisis, an economic problem, and loads of people, for example, lose their jobs or companies start shutting down because they can't keep going. Well, if people are losing their jobs, companies are shutting down, they're using less energy. And as they stop commuting to work or driving around, they stop transporting goods, keeping shops open, the amount of energy required falls. And that can lead to, that decrease in demand can lead to a fall in the price of oil. Down here, you've got OPEC cutting targets. We're going to discuss OPEC in a moment. But OPEC is an organization which controls, and we call them a cartel, they control the price of oil because they control the supply of oil. Now, if they cut their targets, that means they're reducing the supply of oil. And they're doing it deliberately because if they restrict supply, they make oil rarer, and then the value of it goes up. And you can see here, there is so much of a rise in oil prices. I found this cartoon from a few years back. Oh, here's my cartoon. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, oil at $35 a barrel. Everyone's happy. It's fueling the global economy. The world economy is propping up the price of crude. They're really happy about that. Oil's now at $70 a barrel. My God, doubling the price of oil. And the global economy is struggling under this. At $99 a barrel. And over $100 a barrel it hit at one point. And of course, this is the big peak we see over here. And to be honest with you, that doesn't last. When we get this point where we're over $100, $125 a barrel, this is the peak of the global economy. And then it's followed by an enormous global financial crisis. So the global financial crisis, which occurred in sort of 2007, 2008, and then was followed up by more downward trends or downward spikes in 2012, had, as we say, a global impact. So that global impact is to say that, the markets dropped, loads of companies had to fire people, or loads of people therefore lost their jobs. People couldn't pay their mortgages, they had to give their mortgages up, and they had to give their homes up and give them back to the bank. They the number of people who needed government help increased, government spending went up. So it was a huge crisis. And partly because of that, and partly because people were really not very confident about the global economy at that time, the price of oil collapsed from record highs to 30-year lows. So again, OPEC at this point intervenes and they cut their targets again. I'm going to ask you now to pick any 2 points on this graph, whether it's the 9/11 attacks or an OPEC cut, and I want you to do a short point, okay, with the following success criteria to explain why that event caused a change in the oil price. So I'll take this one as an example down here. OPEC cuts the targets for how many million barrels of oil per day they're making. Okay, so they're saying we're going to still produce 1.7 million barrels of oil per day, and that's less than they were producing before. Yeah? And from that, then, I'm going to say after OPEC cut the target number of barrels produced per day in 1997, the price of oil rose, it went up to over $30 a barrel. So I'm using some evidence because, giving a reason now, the supply was reduced. So my point is OPEC cuts the supply of barrels, the production of barrels, the price goes up, and that's because the supply was reduced. Okay, and you're going to do something like that twice for me, please, on your worksheet. Pause the video. This is going to take you about 10 minutes. Off you go. Okay, our next task is a little bit of research. Now, it is very quick research. We don't need to do tons and tons of it, but I just want you to have a little look at how much oil do different countries supply, which we have been using the word production, and consume for consumption or use. So I want you to look at some of these major players. We've got Saudi Arabia and the United States of America. Then I've got some curveballs in there, Bangladesh and Brazil. And then I want you to choose, please, your own 2 countries that you are interested in finding out about how much oil they produce and how much oil they consume. It might be that you choose the UK. It might be that you choose any other country that you want to find out about. So you're going to look by Googling the CIA World Fact Book. Now, the World Fact Book is a useful website because it gives you basically facts and figures on every country from all different categories. So you Google CIA World Fact Book, you click on the country you want to look at, for example, Saudi Arabia, and then you click on the economy tab. Now, that's really important that you click on the economy tab. That's where you're going to see oil production, oil consumption, and gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product is an indication of how much the country earns. And sometimes oil production is a big source of money-making income. Also, what I want you to do for each of these 3 figures, once you put the figures in there, is to tell me what rank they are in the world. So we already know that the United States of America is the largest producer of oil in the world. We give them a 1, or maybe it's Saudi Arabia. Ooh, Fabulous Paul doesn't actually know the answer to this question. And for consumption, the USA is definitely number 1, so we can happily put that one there. Okay, so you've got to tell me whereabouts in the world are they in the rankings. This task should take you about 10 minutes. Pause the video, off you go. Okay, thank you for doing that. So One of the things that you probably will have found is that there is a link between oil consumption, how much oil a country uses, and oil and GDP, how much money they earn. And what we notice here in these two cartograms, our cartograms, as you will remember, are maps of the world that have been shifted to show how much of a particular figure there is. So rather than doing it based on land area, which most maps are, we're doing it here in this top map based on GDP and the bottom map based on oil consumption, how much oil they use. And you should notice that they look very, very similar. The larger a country's GDP is, the higher their oil consumption is. And, this can be for a variety of reasons. This could be the fact that in wealthy countries like European countries and Japan, huge numbers of people own cars, and therefore their demand for petrol is really, really high. It's also found in the types of foods that we eat, which need to travel long, long distances and therefore require lots of fuel to bring them to us. And our basic consumer lifestyles, eating out, drinking from a plastic bottle, using disposable takeaway containers, frequently buying clothes, all of that stuff consumes huge quantities of oil. So there's a very strong correlation between countries that consume lots of oil and countries that have a large amount of money. But there is not a very strong correlation between oil consumption and oil production. That doesn't mean there's no overlap. There are some overlapping countries. Say, for example, the United States has high oil production and high consumption. But obviously, completely outsized here, we've got the Arabian Peninsula. This is Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and then you've got Iran and Iraq up here. Or Kuwait might be this one here. And, they're producing a huge quantity of oil compared to how much they're consuming. Venezuela is this one down here, which we discussed last lesson. Japan, you'll notice, disappears completely. Japan has next to no energy resources of its own other than nuclear power plants. But even then, it has to buy the nuclear material from other people. Okay, and we can see that up here in Europe, pretty much only people in the North Sea. So the UK and Norway have large energy production. So let's go back to this term that we heard before, OPEC. You do need to know this. This is not an extension task. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they are a cartel. Now, you probably know the word cartel from like drug companies or drug gangs. It's the same thing. A drugs cartel controls the supply of drugs from its source to its use. And an oil cartel does the same thing. They control the supply of oil right from where we extract it from the ground all the way up to where it gets used. And you might not be surprised by some of the names that we see here. So amongst the largest, these are the 10 biggest oil companies in the world. We've got people like British Petroleum in here, Royal Dutch Shell, Chevron, ExxonMobil. These are companies that you even see petrol stations for. So they really do control the whole supply. Now, also amongst here, you've got what you should be expecting, I hope, people like Saudi Aramco, which is obviously based in Saudi Arabia. PetroChina maybe comes as a surprise, but PetroChina is obviously China's state-owned energy company. And similar to that is over here, Gazprom. Gazprom is Russia's state-owned energy company. Okay, so something that Russia and China have in common is their theoretically communist ideologies. Okay, so they have quite similar political systems. And one of the things that we find more often in communist countries is that they are more likely to have state-owned companies, particularly where it's a very important company. So if you think about how devastating it would be if we didn't have a reliable energy supply, you can understand why important it is that the government in some cases wants to control the supply of energy. I just want to ask you though, thinking other than maybe Saudi and national Iranian oil, if we were thinking about PetroChina and British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell, are these places, the Netherlands, the UK, are these places that have loads of oil production? No. And where on this list is our Venezuela, for example? It's a really unfortunate thing, but actually, many of the companies that are making money from oil production are not the ones who are based in the countries that have the oil resources. So, this is almost like a form of foreign direct investment where BP goes to another country and says, we have the expertise, we're going to come and help you with your oil, you're going to give us lots of profit, you'll make some money too, but we're going to make loads of money as well, even though we actually don't have the oil resources ourselves. We don't own them, but we'll help you get them out and we'll take a cut. So of the countries here, of the companies here, these four are in OPEC. These are in that controlling group. And what OPEC does is it makes decisions about how much oil should be produced. So, for example, as we saw here, OPEC made a decision here to say, cut the amount of oil that we're producing. We want the price to go up. Now, if they wanted the price to come down, they would say, let's produce more oil. And you can see here, again, it probably wasn't a problem. They were probably producing lots and lots of extra oil. At this point, they had low spare capacity. That means that they were producing quite a lot of oil, but there wasn't lots of spare oil going around. And that led to this big spike in oil prices. But then after this economic crash, huge collapse in the global financial markets, OPEC is hit really hard. All of a sudden, nobody wants any oil, nobody needs it, and so they've actually had to cut their targets quite significantly. Okay, so a decision like this, when it means controlling 45% of all of the oil supply in the world, changes the price completely. Yeah, and although these four guys officially work together, these two are also involved in what we call OPEC plus, i.e. they're not officially part of OPEC, but they do exactly what OPEC says. And so actually you can see now how much of our oil supply is controlled by just one group of companies and countries. So this is what I was saying before. The largest oil reserves, this is how much oil is left in particular countries. And yes, there are lots of countries with smaller quantities of oil that add up to 40%, but Venezuela in South America has up to 20% up to 15%, sorry, of the remaining global oil reserves. Okay, and that is 211 billion barrels of oil. Okay, and they're basically saying that at the current rate that they're producing, which is not huge, but the current rate they're producing, they could keep going for like 2,000 years. Yeah. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has got almost 20% of the world's oil reserves remaining, 265 billion barrels remaining. But because they produce so much oil, although they've got more than Venezuela, their oil is only going to last, in theory, about 700 years. Okay? And if they up the amount of oil they extract, if they continue to take out more and more and more, then actually that number is only going to go down. So the locations where there are largest oil reserves remaining, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, well, they will earn lots of money from their oil extraction. But they aren't the only ones. Who is it that we mentioned makes a large sum of money from the extraction of oil? And how does that happen? Can you describe that, please, in your own words? Off you go. Please make sure you've written it down on your worksheet. It goes in here under task 6. See if you can use a key term. Transnational company is the key term that I want you to use in your answer here, please. Give you another second or two. Okay. So, based on our knowledge so far, we can have a little think about this exam question. I'm not asking you to write it down. You've done 6 tasks already. I'm good with that. Okay, but let's just break this exam question down so we feel confident doing them in the future. Using examples. We've got loads of examples from today. Yeah, and if you need some more, go back and find them in our PowerPoint. Explain why oil reserves. Take a moment, see the key term, work out what it means. Reserves is how much is left, and production, so that's how much we're extracting, taking out, are unevenly distributed. And we've said this a couple of times already today, that not everyone has oil supplies available to them. Not everyone is even producing as much oil as each other, and some places have bigger reserves than others. So we could have had any number of things, but some examples of what we could have included are: the Middle East has the highest amount of oil production, and that is due to the large oil reserves in the region. You could have said there are large amounts of oil production in North America due to high demand for oil. You could have said that there's low amounts of oil production in Africa. That doesn't mean that there are low reserves, just that there's lower oil production in Africa due to the lower demand for oil coupled with the expense of extracting the oil. Now, one thing that you will notice is that these all use the phrase due to, and that is really important because the question says explain. And explaining means you have to say why something's happening. Okay, because, therefore, due to, this means that. Those are the phrases I want to hear. Before we finish the lesson, I just wanted to show you that there is an optional video here at the end. It is a bit long. Well, it's 9 minutes. It's not that long. But just so that you're aware of it, it's about coronavirus and oil prices. If you are interested in economics and business and geography all mingled together, and a bit of politics, this is just so interesting. But as I say, it's an optional task. And based on what we've learned earlier in the lesson, do you think that the coronavirus shutdown has led to positive things for the oil price or negative things? Has the oil price gone up or has the oil price gone down, do you think? I do hope that you've worked out that because we've shut down, businesses have stopped, people have stopped going to work, everything is ground to a big halt. Even a lot of the factories had stopped working for a few months in China. Oil production and oil consumption just slowed down completely overnight. And in fact, that had a devastating impact on the oil price, and it even fell into negative figures at one point, where people were paying you to take the oil off their hands. Just take it away like that. Okay, it was only very brief and only in very specific circumstances, but really, really interesting example of how coronavirus pandemic has altered the things that we interact with on every day. Guys, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.